When it comes to the God that has been in the box, I want you to hear me say that I am an atheist. I'm an atheist if God is that kind of rule-making man in the sky, long beard, white hair, the God that's on the roof of the Sistine, ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the God that is angry, actually a little bit moody. I'm an atheist. I don't believe that God exists. And I say that against about every inclination of my youth. I was raised with that God. And I'm so glad that he doesn't exist. Because that God is a bit of an SOB. Right? I mean, that God is really kind of a Greek God. Whatever you like, he doesn't like. In fact, that God is, I've said it before, a little bit like Santa Claus. Right? He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. And if you don't, he'll smite thee. So if that God doesn't exist, and I don't believe that God does, then what God does exist? I want to talk this morning in a bit of a metaphor, and that's really what we're going to do all through this series, because I believe that God is a lot like a homegrown peach. Now, I don't have one with me this morning, because my peach tree is done for the year. Yours too, bro? Yeah, they're done. You don't get them all year long. But the peaches that I got this year were really, you had to, and really fuzzy. Remember peach fuzz? You know, the peaches that we buy in the store, they're not very fuzzy because it's kind of been hybridized out of them. But the peaches on my tree, you had to kind of struggle with this fuzz. And I learned that the fuzz is important. It keeps insects and disease off the fruit. But you take this peach into the kitchen and you wash off that fuzz. You have to eat it standing over the sink. You know that kind of peach? The kind that you bite into and it runs down your face. You don't get a peach like that at most supermarkets. Not even Whole Foods. The $47 peach at Whole Foods doesn't even taste that good. And it's because the peaches that we buy in the market come from other places. And they've had to travel a long distance. And because they have to travel such a long distance and last such a long time, brilliant plant geneticists hybridize those peaches so that they'll stay hard longer and travel well and won't bruise and be uniform in size and appearance. And when they get done kind of fiddling with all of the genetics of that peach, one of the things that they forgot to leave in was the taste, right? And that, to me, is the most brilliant metaphor for God that we've created. When I say we, humanity over the millennium have created, and now Christianity kind of in the last at least 2,000 years, but Judaism certainly before that, we've created kind of this God that packs well. But we've hybridized all of the taste out of him. And so we know what to expect and what not to expect. In fact, this is why, did you see the Hudson out there this morning? It started today. That's why I say that I think that God is a lot like a 1950 Hudson, the God that we've hybridized. He was important at one time, years ago. Nationally, years ago, 70% of our population went to church. Isn't that funny? I think it is. It's like, what? And it's funny because in Marin, about 3% of our population attends church. Now, I don't blame people for not going to church. It's terribly boring. And it was relevant at one time, but now you kind of get together and you talk about this guy in the sky that's angry, and you go, why would anyone want to show up for that? I feel bad enough about myself, right? And so, although that Hudson out there was relevant at one time, it's terribly irrelevant now. It's not the fastest, not the safest. Talk about safety features. The only safety feature that car has is that it weighs 6,000 pounds. And with a Prius, it will win every fight. That's the only safety feature it has. This Hudson was graciously preserved by other people for our enjoyment. You look at it and you just smile. I do. God's a lot like that. Graciously preserved for our enjoyment. We take him out for a Sunday drive. That's what this car is for. It's not a daily driver. You don't use it every day, just once in a while. Ceremonies, parades. That's what God has become. Weddings, funerals, maybe Christmas and Easter. You take him out, you take him for a spin, you put him back in the garage, because that God, although you feel some obligation, is rather irrelevant. So what is God really like? I want to read, and let me just say this. When we talk about what is God really like, you will find that when, at least this document that I'm going to use this morning, and I'm also going to use a little bit of poetry from a Sufi poet named Hafiz, whom I love. But when you look at the Bible, when we really get serious about talking about God, you know where we are? We're in the poetry sections. Now that should be like a big kind of blinker. Like, God is not a list of empirical evidence or bullet-pointed data. God is alive mostly in humanity, in poetry and art and music. When we are most like God, we are creating. And so when David, this guy that we just talked about for so many weeks, sits down and writes, and especially in this little passage in Psalm 139, David writes about God in ways that are remarkable. And although this isn't the passage I want to hang out in this morning, I want to just begin here. Psalm 139, if you have spent any time with the Bible, you're familiar with this one. Listen to David. "Oh God, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from far off. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with me. You know me. Before a word is on my tongue, God, you've heard it. You hem me in behind and in front. You've laid your hand on me." And then David says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too lofty for me to understand, to grasp." We need to understand that one piece, that God is too much for us to take in. Now, that does not mean that God is not knowable. And my favorite metaphor we used last week, like a parent playing hide-and-go-seek with a 3-year-old, right? You leave part of your leg out, sticking out of the closet so the 3-year-old can find you. That's what God does. God leaves us clues. Now, it's interesting what David says in Psalm 139 when he's describing God and God's kind of activities in a poem that's later set to music. He said, "This knowledge is too much for me." Knowledge. Wait a second. I thought we were saying you can't really know anything about God. Well, let me just take a second and give you this kind of parenthetical thought. Faith is the practice of actually kind of trusting in something that can't be proven, right? You have to actually expend yourself to kind of say, you know what? I can't get my brain around this, but something deep inside me says that this is right. It's an intuitive exercise. Now, what I have found in my life, that the things, like God, in which I express faith, come to me as a more secure knowledge than those things that I seem to be able to empirically prove. In other words, that knowing. Now, I would say it like this. I don't know for sure that God exists, but I know for sure that God exists. I don't know if that makes sense or not. It certainly isn't going to make sense to the people listening to the podcast. I don't know for sure that God exists. In other words, I cannot prove it to you. But there is something deep inside me that looks at the clues and says, there is a God. That knowing, that one thing. And I would even go further. My kind of gut level faith knowing not only knows that there is a God, but also knows and agrees with the fact that God is benevolent and love. That is one thing that I know more than anything else in my life. See, I know my bank balance. I can check it right online. Love it. I know where I live. I know my wife intimately. I know I have 3 sons, and I know all of these things. But the one thing I know that is deeper and greater and more grounding than all of those things is this gut-level knowing. And interestingly, in the Older Testament, they talk about knowing something, forgive me, but they talk about knowing something from your bowels. I know you don't want to discuss bowels. But do you understand that the writer is trying to get to that feeling that you have deep inside yourself that something is true? That's the knowledge that David says, this knowledge of God, that God is this kind of God, is too much for me. Now, what I want to do is talk about that God. For too long, God has been a blanket answer to every question. When we get to the end of ourselves, and historically, when we've gotten to the end of science, we go, well, yeah, God must have done it. And the problem is that stops us. There was a Sunday school class of little boys, 4th and 5th grade little boys. And, you know, if you grew up in Sunday school, you realize soon that the answer to every question is either love, God, or Jesus. So you don't have to pay attention, right? And so, teacher's making this point, and little Johnny's listening, and she says, so, Bobby, what do you think? And Bobby says, God. She says, right. And then she takes another stab at something and asks little Johnny, what do you think? And Johnny says, love. And the teacher said, right. And so this little guy's thinking, okay, there's only one choice left, right? And so the teacher says, so what do you call this fuzzy animal that lives in the woods and has this big bushy tail and loves to eat nuts and lives up in the trees? And this kid is going crazy because she asks him and he says, well, I know the answer must be Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel. And that's what we do. We only ask questions that can be answered by this God that we have come to hybridize into this tasteless one who does what he does and is who he is and has become largely irrelevant, and that is the God to whom I say I'm an atheist. And I say, good riddance. What I'm interested in is the God that shows up in the Bible and other religious texts, the God that shows up in my life, the God that shows up in your life, a God, and interestingly, you need to understand this as we move ahead, and there's going to be some random thoughts like this one, but you need to understand that God is, I'm going to say it slowly, but then we'll put it together so that you understand what I mean. God is no thing. Now you say that fast and it sounds bad, right? God is nothing. What does that mean? God is not a thing. God is not in a place. God does not have a body. God does not have a form. God is not a thing. But the remarkable part about God is that he is one who can be discovered with the senses. Your senses are important in understanding who God may be. And that's why David, thousands of years ago, wrote this one phrase, "Oh, taste and see that God," and the word God there is the word Yahweh. Taste and see that God is good. Wouldn't it be nice if that were true? I think that it is. My translation of Psalm 34:8, go ahead and take a bite. Oh, taste and see that God is very good. I want to talk about tasting for a little bit this morning. tongues are something, aren't they? Have you heard of taste buds? Yeah, you've got them. You've got them because they help you. They help keep you alive. They also help you enjoy Little Debbie's. Taste buds are remarkable things. You've got somewhere between 8 and 20,000 of them on your tongue. And tasting takes you below the structure of that thing and into the substance of it. Now, I don't know what you like to taste, but tasting and this kind of idea, in our area, we really do tasting well, right? I mean, you can drive 20 miles from here and you can go to places designed for tasting, can't you? Yeah, I mean, you could spend the afternoon tasting. That's what you do. And I've never really understood that, tasting. People taste these little tastes of liquid, purplish liquid, and they say things like this. This is an irresistible wine whose elegance draws you sublimely into its orbit. An intense ruby garnet color, its redolent of a profusion of aromas of coffees, cherries, sun-dried fruit. Its high alcohol makes it full and generous in the mouth, and it overwhelms the palate with intense flavors, prolonging your pleasure with its characteristically slight, bitter finish. And I'm not sure what he's drinking, but that's not what I got. But there are ways to taste something and take it apart like that. Have you heard of super tasters? Super tasters are people that have an unusually high amount of taste buds. You can tell if you're a super taster, and I was going to do this morning, but we don't have time. But when you go home today, you can do this little experiment. A super taster, you can take blue food color, everybody's has it, and put a couple of drops on your tongue, and then swish it around in your mouth, and then just go out without looking in the mirror. No. And then look in the mirror. If your tongue is completely blue, you're probably not a super taster. Because your regular tongue construction will absorb blue, but your taste buds won't. If you go, wow, I don't see a lot of blue, it's because the taste buds in your mouth aren't kind of holding on to that blue color. Now, I expect some pictures this week of how this went. Tasting. Tasting takes us below the structure into the substance, and tasting is like testing. In other words, God is saying, take me for a test drive. Do you love test drives? I can remember when I was younger and had no money that I would go to the Audi dealer from time to time. And I would wear nice clothes. Kind of swagger in. And they would give me test rides. I love that. The great thing about God is He doesn't do what the televangelist does. Televangelist says, okay, I want you all in. Are you all in? I say, well, wait a minute, what am I getting all into? Well, yeah, you're in or you're out. Make your call. God never does that. God says, take me for a test ride, kick my tires, taste me, and you'll see that I'm good. You can train your taste buds. Lynn and I have been on this a couple of weeks ago, a little diet where we stopped eating sugar, which cut out 90% of my diet. You think I'm joking. No bread. So my average breakfast, this is up until now, my average breakfast was a couple of bagels with butter, one with jelly, one without, because I wanted to cut back on calories. And then I would stop at the Safeway and get a pack of Little Debbie's. They're like the perfect food, easily packable, and then a Red Bull. I'm ready. Bring it. I'm ready. And then we said, you know what? No sugar, no bread, no dairy. What else didn't we have? No fun. But what happened? What happened was, by around Thursday, I started feeling great. Like, wow, I'm like more present and awake and not bloated and not dying. And I realized that even in that short week, now, you have to understand that I haven't had a Little Debbie for 2 weeks. Hi, I'm Joe. And the amazing thing is, in just that short of time, my taste and the desire for eating things is beginning to change. Now, this happens. If you stop giving your body all of that sugar all of the time and begin eating a little more healthy. Now, that breakfast was after a 32-ounce coffee, of course. You stop giving your body all of that sugar all the time, and your body will stop craving it after a while. And now it seems kind of unappealing to me. Kind of unappealing. Some people like different things, though, right? I mean, look in your notes. Do you see that horrible thing? What is that? My gosh. Here's my theory about Brussels sprouts. In 1930, the country was in this deep depression. People were starving. And someone in Michigan or Minnesota stumbled across this unfortunate patch of ground and found these little miniature cabbages and said, well, I'm starving, so I might as well try one. And they boiled it, and it stunk up the whole house, but they ate it, and it kept them alive. And so they began marketing Brussels sprouts. They're cheap to grow. They're kind of packed with all kinds of energy. But listen, we're no longer in this Great Depression. You don't have to eat them anymore. Now there are all these other wonderful vegetables. Now I know some people love Brussels sprouts. My wife included, loves them. And people in my life say, well, I know you don't like Brussels sprouts, always make fun of them. You've never tasted the way I prepare Brussels sprouts. And so the unfortunate thing is people bring over Brussels sprout dishes. Try this one and this one. And I'm thinking, if you don't dip it in chocolate, I'm not going to like the Brussels sprout. But see, that's the beautiful thing about humanity. We don't all taste, all of our tastes aren't the same. So some people look at a Brussels sprout and they go, gross. Some people say, oh my gosh, they're delicious. And some people are just like, meh, I don't, take them or leave them. That's why we call it a taste. Your taste in clothing, your taste in cars or house colors. And so when David says, what I really am excited about is the fact that if you actually taste God, you will see that God is as delicious as a homegrown peach. Then the question for me is, okay, how do I do that? How do I take a bite of God? I mean, is that a reasonable question? I think it is. Well, the beautiful thing about this passage in the Psalms, and this is Psalm 34, the beautiful thing is that David actually gives us kind of a brief recipe. Here are some things that you can do to, in essence, begin the activity of tasting God, to see if indeed God is good or not. And I would say to you, if you find God distasteful, then don't take any more bites. And in fact, I would go so far as to say, if you find God distasteful, it's because you're not really chewing on God. You're chewing on some abhorrent kind of belief that is still tucked back in the psyche that was implanted there by somebody. I want to read this full passage once more, and the words will come up on the screen. They're in your notes as well. David says, taste and see that the Lord. Now, when you're reading in the Older Testament, right? Bible has two halves. Older Testament, Newer Testament. I call it older and not Old Testament because a lot of times when things are old and we have a new one, we don't use the old one anymore, right? So the Older Testament is still a beautiful way to hang out. Whenever you see the word Lord, in 4 capital letters, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. You'll notice it. It's translating the Hebrew word Yahweh, which is this mysterious God. The God who says, I am who I am. It's a part of speech. It's a verb. It's, I am who I am. I am that which I am. It's like God saying, well, this is my name, but it doesn't clear much up. It's the God of mystery, the God that kind of shows up. So taste and see that that God is good. Blessed is the man. And then there's 3 things David says. Here's how I do it. Here's how I taste. Now, there's probably other ways, but this is how David does it. He says, blessed is the man or woman, the person who takes refuge in him. And then these words that we so misunderstand whenever we read them. Fear the Lord. What does that mean? As a father, the last thing I want to be is feared. I do not want my children to be afraid of me. Now, some leaders will tell you, well, fear is a great motivator. It's not. It's a terrible motivator. So why does it say fear God? Well, we've missed the boat here. It's just a horrible word to use to translate. And every time you see it, I just want you to insert the word wonder. Wonder about God. Not just wonder like, I wonder, but wonder like you're at Bolinas and there's clouds in the sky and you see a sunset that just goes, wow, awe and wonder. That's the idea. Not, I'm afraid of God, of what he may do to me, but I stand in God's presence with a sense of wonder and awe. So that's the second idea. Wonder and awe. Give to God wonder and awe. For those who have wonder lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who, and here's a great word, seek God will lack no good thing. David unpacks 3 big ideas that I want to just take a second and unpack with you. So the first one is to take refuge. Take refuge. Now, what does that mean? Well, the idea of taking refuge isn't so much you're in physical danger and you need a place to hide, although that's included. The primary idea of taking refuge is confide in. Confide in God. How do I taste him? Well, you confide in him, first of all. How do you do that? God, it's Joe. I'm having a lousy day. Yesterday wasn't much better. I don't have much hope for tomorrow. I'm not sure what's going on in my life. But I'm here and I'm struggling. It's confiding in God with what you're really thinking and feeling. Something that you wouldn't tell another human being unless they were the most intimate and safe relationship. Now, you don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to write it in an email that will, who knows what will happen to your emails. You can just be still in your commute and say, God, I'm really nervous about this project I have at work. Now, you wouldn't maybe announce that to another human because you don't want to appear weak or unprepared. How do you taste God? Well, spend a moment every day, or 2 or 100, taking refuge in him. And now, what does that mean? Well, you confide in God and then see what happens. See, the great thing about this is I don't have to defend God. Like, I'm not giving you a guarantee that God's going to show up. Like, well, if he did God, I confided in God all week last week and nothing happened. And I'm like, well, I'm not God. But my experience is that when I confide in him, things come into my mind that heretofore had not been there. And I think that those thoughts are from him, from her, from God, from the nurturing, good God. Take refuge. Then David says, fear him, wonder. We have lost that. Have you seen the moon the last 3 nights? Oh, man. We're too busy to see the moon. But I stand in my backyard and I look in the moon. Remember last year we had the blood moon? Remember that? All my life, I'm 53. All my life people have been telling me about the man in the moon. Did your parents tell you the man in the moon? There's a man in the moon. It's a face that you see. Is this news to anybody? Like maybe this is what... I grew up in New Jersey. Some very odd things. But my father would always sing a song about the man in the moon, and I never saw the man in the moon. And then last year in this blood moon, I was in the backyard with Lynn, and I got out the binoculars, and I was looking at the moon, and I went, "Oh, there he is!" You know, in those pictures that's blurry, and you kind of fuzz your eyes, and you see it. First time I saw it, that's the man in the moon. And, obviously it's just a different arrangement of craters, but wonder. If we don't have a sense of wonder, if you can't cultivate, when you look at something. The other day, Lynn and I were on our way into the doctor's appointment for my knees, and there was this snail. Just like, look at that, there's a snail. Yeah, it's a snail, all right. But you see your children sleeping? Scott and Ellie sit in the back there. He's a barista at Starbucks on Redwood. He's a beautiful man. She's lovely. They just had a new baby. Can't wait to meet that baby. Put your nose in a baby's neck. Now, it's a little weird when it's not your baby. I get that. Don't do that at Target, But when you are in a place where you can do it, that smell, it's wonder. Wonder. When you begin to take refuge or confide in God, and you're open to wonder, and then you begin to seek. Now, seek, what does that mean? It means to live with a sense of expectancy. Now, I'm not saying have expectations. You have expectations, you're going to be disappointed, right? Just the way it is. Whatever it is that you're expecting to happen, I'm telling you right now, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But living with expectancy is something different. Up until Friday morning, early in the morning, Ellie was living with expectancy. She said, "I know that I'm pregnant. I know there's a little baby boy in there." She even knew that. "But I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know when this child is going to come." She was hoping, right? She's living with a sense of expectancy, maybe today. And a sense of expectancy in life is, I'm not sure where God is going to show up, but I know God will show up. I'm seeking it. I'm looking for the divine. Now, I have found in my life, in my own experience with this, and my relationship with God, that these three ideas turn into what I want to talk about as a what is it that I want to talk about it as? A reinforcing loop. Now, Erica Beadle taught me about this years ago. Reinforcing loop. You take refuge, and it leads to more wonder. And when you wonder, you're open more, and you begin to kind of live in a sense of expectancy more. And that expectancy gives you the comfort to take a deeper sense of confiding in it and more refuge in God, which moves you, and this happens in this never-ending loop where one reinforces the other, so you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And what we're talking about actually is delving into the experience of God. Now, I went to school for years to fill my head with the data about God. And I have to tell you that it did more in me. It did more harm than good. Because I could stand up front and pontificate on what God was like. And then I could also look out at people and say, well, God doesn't like that person. My, if they only knew God like I knew, they knew that God wouldn't like them very much. What a wonderful thing, right? Now, it's not like we can't learn anything about God with our minds. We've got these brilliant minds. Of course we can. But we have to understand that what we're talking about is knowing God not by empirical understanding, but by experience. Have you ever used this phrase? Oh, you had this great experience, and I'm just about to bring this thing in for a landing. You have this great experience, and you say to yourself, I can't wait to tell so-and-so. And you begin to tell them, and you think that they're just going to light up, and they're like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And you go, well, you had to be there. Words cannot describe. Have you ever used that phrase? I wondered this week about some experiences that words cannot describe, and I did a little bit of research. Here are some. Skydiving. Anybody ever go skydiving? Jim, can words describe it? No. You have to do it, right? Yeah. I don't recommend it, but you will get a sense of something that you won't have by Jim standing up here and telling us about it. Being fired. Anyone ever fired? You can't describe how deep down in your gut life-wrenching it is. You have to, again, don't recommend it. Being elected to public office. Anybody ever elected to public office? Yeah, well, we don't like those people anyway, so scratch that one off the list. Buying your first home. Remember signing those papers? Sitting in the office going, oh my gosh, are we making the big mistake of our life? I thought growing up and living in Pennsylvania and Indiana and Minnesota, buying a house was the biggest mistake of our life when you're signing a mortgage for $75,000. Then we moved to Marin. And we just gave up, right? Like, yep, okay, yep. Where do I sign? Fine. Battling depression. When there's no logical reason for you to feel so bad that you can't even get out of bed in the morning. Again, you don't want to experience it, but you can't describe it to someone who hasn't. What God deeply desires, I think, is a human being who wants to take a bite out of, not just entertain thoughts, not just kind of have a great exercise and discussion about who God may be, but to actually begin confiding in that God and then beginning to wonder about that God and then seeking that God in ways that are heretofore unknown will bring you into a relationship with that God that is life-changing. Guys, you can come up. I want to read this poem. I love this. Hafiz is just a Sufi poet. Lived a long time ago. This is one translation of his work in a poem called We Should Talk About This Problem. I love this. There is a beautiful creature living in a hole you have dug. So at night I set fruit and grains and little pots of wine and milk beside your soft earthen mounds, and I often sing, but still, my dear, you won't come out. I have fallen in love with someone who hides inside of you. We should talk about this problem. Otherwise, I will never leave you alone. That's the God that I know. You can't spreadsheet him. But for thousands of years, people have been writing poetry and songs and trying to describe their experience with him. My hope for us, Quest, is that this week we will in some new way taste and see that God is good. So God, thank you. There's so much we don't understand and will never understand, and yet there is this deep sense of rightness about how we've been talking about this. And so I pray that you would help us to take refuge and confide and to begin to wonder again and to seek, to live with expectancy, God, and what is it that you're going to do and how you work. Help us to keep those three words in mind and to do them, Father. And we'll look forward to knowing you, not just knowing about you. Thank you. Amen. Thanks, you guys. Have a great day.